Thank you all so much for joining us at this session on communicating across ideological divides on this second day of Open Future Forum focused on hunger, nutrition, and food systems. And I will say that the thread of this particular discussion has come up so richly in so many ways over the last 2 days' discussions around this need to navigate how to have difficult conversations with one another, how to communicate with those we don't necessarily agree with or come from the same place or perspective as, and as kind of the need for a session like this one just felt like it was emerging as we were curating. I couldn't imagine anyone more perfect to hold this space than Marcina and the Reconsider team. And so first, before we dive in, I do want to briefly thank our co-conveners for the forum. Today's sponsor is North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, and I also want to deeply thank our co-conveners, American Sustainable Business Network, Bluefin Investment, Eco Restoration Alliance, El Puente, Global Unity, the Guild of Future Architects, Heartland P5, Imagine World, the Institute of Ecotechnics, Intergen Family, Kinship Earth, Partnerships for Change, Pro-Social World, Reconsider, Toxic Free Future for Our Children, Triangle Foundation, and United Refuge. And our convening partners for this particular session are Reconsider, and so handing it now over to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And I'm Marcina.
And I'm Steve.
We're two of the founders of Reconsider. And Reconsider, it's we're a nonprofit organization, and we work on the ability for us to kind of face and look at consciousness and what we're doing and creating on this planet. And right now we're in the middle of a project that is working on how do we, bridge between the medical, the mystical, the sacred, and the scientific. And our projects have, began, we're both in media and workshops and conversations and gatherings is really what we're focused on, and to bring us to a greater understanding of not only ourselves, but the greater world that we live in. Steve, do you want to add anything?
No, that's great. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, and one of the main things that we've done is we work with different films. One of the first films that we worked with was Planetary, was all about the evolution of life on the planet, and where it's brought us to the current situation that we're in now, which is the midst of a 6th mass extinction on the planet and facing both ecological and basically humanitarian issues, and the challenge that it is to have people be able to face and have conversations and kind of really deal with some of the issues that we find ourselves in. The next movie that we worked with and conversation that we worked with is a movie called Disturbing the Peace. And it's based in the Middle East. It's around previous both Palestinian and Israeli fighters who put down their weapons to show that there was another way. And really what that movie was about was the ingrained narratives that we're all born into. And there's a saying that if you were born where they were born and you were taught what they were taught, you would believe what they believe. And we traveled basically all over the world with this film. It was translated into over 23 languages. And one of the reasons why, even though it's based in the Middle East, it's really about all of us. And it was, for example, we showed it for several weeks in New York City. And at one point, we had a group of young teenagers that called themselves the Monsters. And they were from an area in Brooklyn. And they watched the movie. And always after the movie ended, we asked them to please, like anybody wants to, just kind of say where they are, what they feel. And one of the young gentleman picked up the mic and he says, I know this is about Israelis and Palestinians, but this is about my neighborhood. And it is an important thing for us to be able to see how these repeating narratives are there no matter what culture we're in, no matter what country we're in, no matter what religion that we're in. So narrative, and Steve, do you have the trailer for that?
Sure. Yeah, happy to share.
If you don't mind, we're just going to play the trailer for that. How fast? Get a sound.
I'm not getting the audio here.
The sound, Steve.
No sound?
No.
You have to be sure to share sound when you share.
As a media guy, he should know that. Seems like no matter how much technology.
I'm not a Zoom guy.
Let's see. Let's maybe try on sharing screen and share screen again
Okay.
and see if it gives you a specific option to
To share the screen again.
share with sound. Yeah.
Which is, oh, here we go. Share sound. Thank you, Caitlin.
Mhm.
Great. We'll go back to the beginning. Appreciate that.
I was 4 years old when we were attacked on Yom Kippur. I remember us running to the shelter in Tel Aviv. It's very concrete for a child. They want to kill us. And I really didn't understand, why do they hate us so much?
ناصر أخوي كان أصغر مني له كان تقريبا عمره 14 سنة. الجيش اللي حكوا له أطلقوا عليه رصاصة. أنا ما بعرفش كيف هذيك اللحظة قدرت أتحمل الموقف.
كان عندي حلم اني اكون مقاتل في صفوف الثوره الفلسطينيه يعني واكون جزء من الكفاح المسلح ضد الاحتلال. كنت مستعد انه اموت في سبيل هاي الافكار.
I was admitted into the most prestigious unit in the Israeli army. I was extremely proud. I knew my father was proud.
صرت أفكر كتير إيش أنا دوري في الحياة هنا. فاخترت إني أعمل عملية استشهادية. זה מקומם, זה פשוט מרגיש טרור. ככה מרגיש טרור בעיניי.
מישהו התקשר ואמר שיש פלסטינים שמוכנים להיפגש איתנו.
كنت كثير خايف انه قد يكون في مصيدة يعني هون.
We find that we actually have something in common. That willingness to kill people you don't know.
عندهم قوة يا جميل مش طبيعي. بده يجي كم واحد من المقاتلين لأجل السلام رفضوا الخدمة يغيروها.
إذا أنت قريتي عن نيلسون مانديلا شخص لحاله غير دوله كان كل الدين وغير كل النظام وانت بتعرف انه شخص لحاله كل شخص لحاله كيف قدر يسوي هيك كيف قدر يسوي
יש פה שני צדדים לא אלימים, ישראלים ופלסטינים שרוצים להיות ביחד.
أنا بفقدش الأمل في فكرة إن السلام إنه ما في طريق ثاني غير السلام.
It's interesting. Since the film came out, they've been nominated for 3 Nobel Peace Prizes, and they are the only group of enemy combatants that are working together during an ongoing armed conflict through nonviolence in the world. And I think what they came to understand in traveling with the film with us for a couple of years after we finished it was that they hold this possibility for so many of us. And we were always asked, and we spent 3 years making this film, mostly in Palestine. And when the film came out, we were constantly asked, is it pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian? And we would say,
Yes.
you know, it's this notion of sides is really interesting, because there's a place beyond what people identify as any side, and represents the kind of freedom that each of them get to experience in their life, to be outside of the story that tell them who the hero is and who the villain, who the victim and who the perpetrator is.
So when we talk about crossing divides, one of the main things that we start in is with the acknowledgement that we were all born into these narratives. And how do we begin to meet another narrative that can actually be even not even in opposition of you, but even wanting you to be non-existent. And we had those experiences with the combatants, and to watch how they were able to use techniques of nonviolence, that it was okay for that person to even not even want their own existence, and they didn't have to fall into the narrative and begin to either hate or create a contrary energy, but to create a compassion for that person and what they were born into. And so it was, one of the things that we talked about is that no matter whether it's on an individual level with our own lives, or in a collective level as we're dealing with groups, how do we begin to break the narratives both within ourselves and then with one another? Are there any questions, comments, or anything at this point that anybody wanted to add or say? Or
how challenging was it for you initially to get these groups to be willing to come together? Or was it already happening and you
No,
just...
it's a great question. First of all, when we met them, they were already in the process of meeting with each other, but it took them a long time to do this. So each of them had an experience, whether it was a trauma or something small even, that threw them far enough outside of the story that they were in to realize they were in a story. And as Marcina likes to say, once you know, you can't not know. And they had each gone through their individual transformation. They had challenged themselves many times. The Israeli soldiers also spent time in prison for a conscientious objection, for refusing to serve. Some of them were already senior officers. The Palestinians also paid a price, but they had gone through their own transformation individually and with their families and their communities. But when a journalist, a German journalist, heard of both of these groups and asked them whether they wanted to meet each other, there was another layer of transformation to go through, because there was great fear that they experienced. The Palestinians assumed that the Israelis were setting them up to kill them. And the Israelis were convinced of the same. And it was the first time that the Israelis actually went into Palestinian territories at that time without weapons. And so it was very challenging for them to get started. And they spent 2 years meeting in private before they went public and were willing to share their story. For us, we met them along the way and began the project with them.
so really what we're talking about here is that in order to be able to break a narrative, the first narrative you have to break is your own. And how do we begin to look at the narratives that we're breaking, and how do we see the other one in a different context? Melina, is it?
Melanie.
Melanie's right.
So deeply moved, just being present to this. I just found this tremendous upwelling of both grief and compassion, and a familiar place where these intractable issues can be met with humanity.
Mhm.
And so my question now, listening to you, is morphed. So obviously coming in to recognize that you have a story, that you're in a story, is the first step. What I heard said was, we realized we have something in common. We're willing to kill people that we don't know.
Mhm.
Then what I'm assuming, and what I'd love to hear you speak towards, is, was there a revelation or an uncovering of common, like universal sort of values that people would come back to touch upon? Was there a touch point that had to do with common values?
I think one of the things that I'd like to say is that, like, when we're looking at the film, like this film, and we're talking about narratives, the people that are in the film are often seen as kind of like heroes and so forth, but is to remember that each of them had somebody that impacted their life, that helped them begin to see things in a different way. And so when Steve says they were thrown outside of their narrative, one of them was from a prison guard whose brother was killed, and then they thought, and she thought that that the prison guard was going to be retaliative, and instead of that, she showed more compassion. And so it kind of like confused the system, so that instead of continuing the story of the narrative, it kind of broke it. Or for Jamil, it was his mother, who then met an issue with violence with her compassion for the other, which was confusing for him as a child. And yet that then started breaking the narrative again. So
So
go ahead, Christopher. You had your hand up. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm also, how could one not be deeply moved by this material? I wanted to raise, at the risk of being very practical, that ugly word, practical, what I'm interested in, a perspective, is their relationship to their own community and their own leadership, as much as their relationship to each other, because obviously to take this stance may alienate you from your own people, and that's part of the journey, I imagine. And then the second facet to that, so it is a two-part question: what is their relationship to their leadership and their community? And then if we move to the point of view of leaders, and we see this across the world, it's commonly observed that leaders often we all struggle to take responsibility for our own personal mistakes. So we might take responsibility for a generic problem or something which is not our own. But if a leader has been a precipitator of hatred, and we can see this adopted, is there an avenue for them to face their own story through this, or is that too hard an ask? And the comparison I was going to do is Belfast, when the Belfast Accord, that the loose parallel to Israel would have been Northern Ireland at a certain point in time, and leadership at that point did step in, and obviously Nelson Mandela was involved with this sort of thing. So there are a few different elements to what I'm asking in order to move forward: the personal move versus their own community, and then how do leaders relate to this? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Steve, do you want to pick that up? You want me to?
Well, I think, first of all, they understand that it does begin, as you said, Christopher, with their personal responsibility. In a sense, disturbing their own sense of inclusion in this narrative. But they also, when it relates to the larger context, they understand that this is not something that's going to be determined by political leaders. Political leaders want to stay in power, and they believe that their work is with the individuals. Their work is in a shift in consciousness, and so they don't get swayed by the changes in the political landscape. In fact, I'd say that they work even harder to stay together and to represent what's possible.
And I think when we're talking about how do we cross these divides, I think it's really important to understand even that in the political realm, is to understand what story they're caught in, and nobody is outside of a narrative. And all of these narratives at one level are making sense. So how do we become curious about how they make sense? But also, if a certain narrative is there, until there's a new narrative that arises, people can be caught in these other narratives without knowing that there's a choice to think differently. Does that make sense? That's what we found with it. And so, it's interesting because if going back into the idea of how do we cross these divides, one of the more powerful tools that we've watched be used is the idea of curiosity, is to be able to ask questions so that you can understand how their perspective makes sense to them. It doesn't mean it's a right perspective or a wrong perspective, but we want to understand how it makes sense to them. And it goes back to the power of knowledge that comes from curiosity. It's like the blind man and the elephant. If people are trying to describe an elephant, and depending on what position they're in, they're going to describe it very differently. But the power for each of us is to be able to not just be able to tell what it looks like from your perspective, but to be able to listen and ask questions about what it looks like from the other perspective. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other issue of commonality is really interesting, because when the film came out, we did screenings for a couple of years in the region, and you could be in Ramallah or in Tel Aviv, in Nablus or in Haifa, and if you didn't speak Hebrew or Arabic, you would have no idea where you were screening it, because the questions were always essentially the same. And what they would come down to was, is there really somebody on the other side that it cares about us? It's really about the recognition of one's humanity and the compassion for whoever's been othered.
And it's one of the biggest, most powerful tools, is to use that empathy when you're speaking to someone who even hates you. And that was also shown very much through the tools of nonviolence that were used by Martin Luther King and many others. Yeah. Elizabeth, would you like to?
Yeah, so I'm curious. We all experience it. We don't even have to be in a war zone, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are wronged, and we feel a righteousness in our surviving that wrong, right? That we have a right to feel anger and revenge and all these emotions. And often the wound feels unforgivable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if there was a specific method or process that they went through to be able to forgive the unforgivable, and did they get there, or did they just kind of like, that's a big transformation, right? Is to get to the point where actually forgiving the unforgivable. Do you feel like they got there, or did they just agree that their commonality of being humans was worth laying down the disputes? So I'm just curious as to kind of how deep this process went.
It's a great question, and the process goes very deep, but it's not about seeking forgiveness. In an interesting way, it's actually about taking accountability. When we were thinking about making this film, I met with Chen, who's the first person who saw an Israeli tank commander, and with Suleiman, who's the Palestinian with curly hair who talks about trying to kill 2 Israelis, and asked them, what is this organization really about? And Chen said, we're a community of people taking responsibility for our own creation. And Suleiman said, we're breaking the cycle of violence by breaking our own sense of victimhood. And both of those ideas were enormously powerful, and they really inspired the film in many ways. So the work that they do is very much rooted in sharing their personal stories. But they're doing that, again, not to seek forgiveness, but to acknowledge what they were willing to do and what they were capable of doing. And to recognize that they're choosing a different way. And in that comes the bridge that gets created. Because ultimately what they see as somebody's integrated themselves is the full humanity of somebody who has been considered the other.
Mhm. Okay, Harriet, or I don't know, Marriott, I'm not sure. Yeah, Harriet.
Thank you. This is just wonderful conversation. I appreciate it so much. I wanted to ask you, I've been working in discussing divides along, mostly along climate change, but it comes into conservative, progressive values as well. And one of the things that I've come across, and this transcends out of the US as well, is there's this discussion, well, if I'm going to go on the other channel so I can understand the way other people think, I'm going to read the other language or read the information so then I can understand the way they're thinking. But that doesn't seem to progress. What I have found, it doesn't progress anyone out of their self-transformation. It's just a way of trying to understand the other. Whereas what you're talking about, and that's where I've seen real transformation, is that self-awareness, that journey that they're happening themselves. And so what I'm interested in, I try to work in this realm, but how to elevate that, how to give people that more of that experience, whether it's just meeting someone or whatever that is, scaling that up, because that's really what you're talking about. And that's what happened in the movie. And I see that all the time on the ground, but it's not just reading, what we talk about here in the US is let's listen to the other channel for a minute,
Yeah. And I think that and I think what Steve was saying before, they all went through like some kind of something that happened. So we call it like, usually people go through some kind of transformational process. And whether it's encountering somebody in a way that just shows an immense compassion, or whether it's something that comes through trauma, because that can come that way. But there's all different ways that you can both be affect and be affected by, and start to just shift a narrative. One of the things that we work with at Reconsider are transformational medicines that include psychedelics, for example, because psychedelics are being used to help open windows of opportunity for there to be a reconnection. That's showing promise in the medical field right now. And one of the things that we talk about is how do we make sure that the message that people are connecting to, which is that oneness that includes the importance of our nature and our connection as us being a part of it, doesn't get lost in this idea of, healing depression and anxiety. Understanding that anxiety and depression might be appropriate responses for the disconnect that we have to our world. And but also watching how, if somebody is disconnected and we judge them, it's not going to make them feel more prone to wanting to connect more. So how do we go past our judgments of others and take them into a state of curiosity ourselves and compassion and meet them where they're at? Just, really quickly, there's someone we're going to be somebody is going to be coming to an event that we're holding around the environment and so forth, is coming from the Midwest and was raised on a farm. And she was talking about how her family, she was raised and they burnt all their trash, including, hairspray containers and everything that and that's still the mentality that they're using on the farm. And that you would expect somebody that's on the farm and working with plants and so forth to have a stronger connection with land and the environment. But it's almost like the opposite. They're disconnected from it. And they have put the story of the connection and the caring about the land on kind of like the rich city people. So it's interesting to understand what the narrative is that's making them make sense to want to almost counter and not become the very thing that they are despising. Does that make sense? Isn't that interesting?
Mm. And are you find it because there's so much social, the negativity and this, the partisanship in social media and the divide. I'm just curious, is that something you focus on in your work and how to counteract that? Everybody's in their silos and they're just, but it needs to break out of those silos and hear and have conversations that.
Yeah, one of the things we encourage people to do is not to take on a label.
Yeah.
I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a progressive, I'm a this or that. I'm a human being, and we're talking about humanity. So if we can stay out of both putting a label on somebody else, but also taking a label ourselves, it can often help open up the conversations. But it's our participation in the divide that's being created and agreeing to it. Yeah.
Have you had success in trying to here in this country too? I know with that exercise and trying to bring, someone both sides of the ideological divide together.
I mean, I think what we do all the time is to bring very different points of view and perspectives together to have the conversation. I think it is something that I think that, well, even like with this movie came out in 2016. So when we toured with it, one of the important things was to be able to hold that space where these difficult conversations can happen. And we had one of the conversations was at the house of was it Steve, the Museum of Tolerance.
Our least tolerant screening.
Yeah, definitely.
At the Museum of Tolerance.
But we had, 2 Palestinian, 2 Israelis, Stephen and I, and we were up on the stage and we let anything be said. And so one woman started saying, the problem with you is that you don't exist, pointing to the Palestinians. And the audience started getting like, whoa, we just kind of like had everybody settle down and everybody on the stage just took a deep breath. And then Jamil, who you just saw in the clip, just spoke really eloquently, just acknowledging the difference in the perspective and then acknowledging a little bit of the history and so forth, not fighting or anything, but in that you're modeling for a whole audience of people how you don't have to enter into conflict, how you can hold the acknowledgement of what something else is said, and present something different. And, does that change everything? And it's sometimes I think it's difficult to understand how much impact we have, because often we have more impact than we think, both in our positive words and also our way that we perpetuate narratives.
And Chris, I think that what you said about the process speaking to the zen of the journey versus the outcome is absolutely true. Suleiman spent 10.5 years in prison from the age of 14. He is the most open-hearted, loving man you could meet. And a couple of years ago, he said to me, I realize I am less interested in the outcome than I am in the journey. Less interested in the outcome than I am in the journey. Because what he realized is that he's living the outcome every day. He's choosing peace within himself and within his community every day. That doesn't mean that he's not working for the end of the occupation. He is. But again, what he's interested in is the energy that he can hold and what he can hold in community. So I very much agree with what you're saying.
And the combatants for peace and other people are definitely building their coalition there. And one of the things we talked about when this movie came out is you can represent so much for so many people. But as you know, there's still conflict in the Middle East. It's not. And so but for a lot of people, it's made a big difference for their life.
We've also, in the last year, we've been doing screenings in Hong Kong and holding virtual workshops, and they're using this film to bridge the divide within their own families and their own communities.
And on the environmental level, I think it's one of those things that's really a very important tool is how do we acknowledge a narrative? How do we not become something that people don't want to engage with for one reason or the other? And how do we create a curiosity so that they can also teach us maybe how their narratives are making sense? Mary?
Yes, my name is Mary Charlotte, and by the way, I interviewed Ken and Sully years ago when the film came out on my podcast, but anyway, and they were so wonderful. But the question that I have for you guys is this, and that is, so much of our polarization in this country is manufactured. I just listened to a presentation yesterday about Russian disinformation, and its whole entire purpose is to polarize us and to weaken trust in one another and trust in democracy and things like that, not to mention a very money-centric right-wing media landscape that's very dangerous. And it's not, it's like we talk about our polarization as if it were organic. It's in many senses, it's not organic. And if those things were to vanish overnight, I think it would be easier to converse. But how do you think about this stuff in this context?
I appreciate that, and I would say too that on the right side they would say that there's a left side that's creating it as well. So I just want to let you know that it is perceived from the other side to be the same, and all and we can see it in every area. And I think that's one of the things that we talk about is how do we create a radical middle, and which refuses to be a part of the left or right way, but actually looks for what does something new look like, and what are you basing your conversations on? Are we speaking about humanity, connection, love, the ability to work together, or do we participate in the ongoing divide of it? So I think one of the things we always talk about, which the combatants did as well, was they always talk about it starts with the personal, and then it starts within your community, so that every culture has to deal with the issues that are in their communities, whether it's the culture of religion, the culture of ethnicity, and so forth. How do we create a place where we're looking at those in a way that helps to transcend the divides and not continue to participate in it? And that's really great that you actually did the interview.
Yeah, no, they were fantastic. I remember it well, but it's still, what you're saying, and I actually work with a group. I do it now, a podcast on regenerative agriculture, which is the ideology of the organization that sponsors it is the radical center. They talk about that in agriculture because there's so many ways that people of differing ideologies can come together in agriculture, because it's about soil health, which is nonpartisan. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about things like climate, and there have been so many lies fed about climate, and people simply don't believe in anything resembling reality, that's the manufactured part. I don't know how I can sort of look within myself and find their perspective when that perspective is just basically the result of fossil fuel public relations machine that is out for profit.
Right. There's a great book that talks about called Merchants of Doubt. And there's a lot of peddling of all of the misinformation. And sorry.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important to know that too, and to be able to listen to them and then say, what's interesting is I'm kind of reading this, so that for me, what we've watched is that your ability to listen to them, and then also be able to share your perspective allows a lot of time there to be more openness to it. But yeah, it can be very frustrating at times. Yeah, definitely. Elizabeth, did you want to?
Yeah, so there's sort of the talk or the narrative here coming up about how this conflict's been manufactured and manipulated, and it's true. There's no denying it, but it's not. It's in our human nature. Conflict, tension exists whenever two people meet, right? There's a natural tension there. And conflict arises when these two different perspectives begin to rub against each other. And the manipulators are using that kind of inherent behavior pattern within humans that just exists, it exists in our own families, it exists in our own, and they're using that and they're making great use of that on both sides to fulfill their agenda.
Yeah.
So going deeper into that in recognizing that if we can begin a narrative that removes the emotional attachment to the conflict and recognize that conflict's okay. It's and see it more as a dispute. It's like a dispute is where there's no harmony, there's no, right? And so what I'm trying to get to is that when we're triggered, if we can see, like, change the narrative that the trigger is an opportunity for growth rather than a choice to put up our fists and fight or defend, it takes that emotional charge out and allows us to recognize when we're triggered, it's something inside of ourselves that we need to embrace and look at. And so I'd like to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Well, that's where the curiosity can be very helpful, because when we get triggered, if we go and respond in a way, then that can create more conflict. But if we ask some questions, we can do a couple different things. First of all, we can create a place where they can explore inside of themselves through questioning. But what's really important in being able to meet them, and this is in nonviolence communication as well, is to sincerely be curious, is to be able to ask, well, what ways do you feel that we can make a better world? There can be questions that are posed that allow them to kind of explore it with you. And then you can find a place, one place where you can create a commonality, no matter what it's based on. And it's really interesting because no matter where somebody is, and ultimately we all kind of really want the same thing.
Yeah, and I would say also it's about not dehumanizing the other. When we go back to the Museum of Tolerance screening with Jamil, his response to being dehumanized and being told you don't exist was not to do the same. It was actually to meet it with compassion and curiosity. And what that allowed for everybody in the room was to feel the different energies. And it allowed for that space of curiosity to understand what her trauma was and why it made sense for her to hold that place. And it's the only way in which those things can begin to be unraveled and the knots untied in some way.
Right. Melanie, do you want to? Yeah. Oh, you're on mute.
You just had such a sweet sort of epiphany as I was listening to Elizabeth and then you, Marcina, and where the conversation went with that. And what I realized, as Elizabeth was saying, is as human beings, when we get contrast, so I'm a physical therapist, people go along in their lives until they have an injury or an accident. And now the contrast of not being able to walk or having pain in an area motivates action. And when the contrast comes up, if we're able to see it as an opportunity to further clarify what we want, if we're drawn inward to actually see, okay, here this is happening, what do I want? I know maybe I don't want this. What do I want?
Hmm.
And then coming back to what was just spoken is that we're all inside, with all this turmoil and details of issues and policy, we all want the same thing. To be seen as worthy, to have compassion shown to us, and to have a sense of fairness. And coming back to that through the avenue of contrast, somehow making that be okay to be in that kind of extremis, and the people you're outlining have been in extreme situations. And yet they chose to see their narrative, to see how they were responding to that. And from that chose what they want, when they could have chosen trauma and get a lot of people to agree with them. They could have really started a movement of being victims, and they didn't. So I'm just so grateful. It's going to really keep bubbling for me. I want to just keep writing and thinking about it. I'm very moved. So thank you.
That's beautiful. And it's one of those things, because we want that. We want to be able to be seen. We want to be cared for. And ultimately we want to feel loved, and it's interesting because when we do have the triggers, and I love, Elizabeth, that you brought up the triggers. When we work and Reconsider and the work that we do, we always talk about how, anger is always about not getting your way. Every time you're triggered, it's you're not getting your way. Every time you're angry, it's because you're not getting your way. And then the question is, and often what happens is that we behave in a way that is actually the opposite of what we want to create. So the trigger itself and the feeling of either anger or frustration or whatever it is different than behavior. And so you can get triggered, and then the question is to ask yourself, what is it that you want that you're not getting? And then see if you can speak from that place. It's because speaking from a place of not what you want, not against or railing against something, but actually from a peaceful place to say, you know what, I really want to create a world that we all feel safe in. And then that's the commonalities that we can start to connect with. Chris?
I was interested, I made a comment about hope, but I was intrigued by the parallel. I'll give a story. I've been working with a number of bodies in Australia with our First Nation community, which is suffering great trauma. And, one of the big observations is to pull yourself out of a traumatized space, you need hope, or the belief that it can make a difference. And if you don't think it can make a difference, you don't step up. So people say, take responsibility for yourself, but you have to believe responsibility will make a difference. And I'm intrigued here about, from that, the function of the narrative of hope, whether it be pulling yourself out of your own trauma versus blaming others. And so independent of, this is what we're talking about in the Middle East is a geopolitical trauma, but we see this in marginalized communities. We see this in so many spaces, the idea of, it's hopeless and I can't save myself. And then from that, blame other people. So this narrative appears in a different guise all around us, and so forth. And so it's really the question of what is the power of actually thinking that, I could step up and make my life more positive through not being angry, and etc. And so from that we get a deep universal sort of power out of this, which is more than just war. It's about hoping and etc. And being able, and also the neural thing. I mean, you got psychedelics. It's very interesting to talk about ecstasy as well in the same class, which is to unplug the neural scar tissue or synaptic thing from trauma, which overlaps. To have hope, you also need to unwire the brain a bit to do that, I think. I'm just interested, there are a few thoughts there, but I'm intrigued by the parallels in the space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve, you?
No, go ahead.
I thought you were going to talk about because I mean, you're talking always when you talking about the conversation that you had about whether it's going to make a difference or not. And that's the wrong conversation.
Yeah. I mean, that question does come up a lot. And, I was with two religious leaders a few years ago at a lunch. They're both environmentalists, and they just finished a panel. And one of them was arguing that we still had time to make a difference, to turn things around. And the other one was arguing we're past the point of no return. And I'm listening to them go back and forth. And I stopped them at one point and I said, aren't you asking the wrong question? Isn't the question, how do you want to live your life as an expression of gratitude for life itself, regardless of the outcome? Because the problem of getting stuck in the, will it make a difference? What can the outcome be? Does my action mean something in the larger scope of things? Is essentially setting up a transaction. It's setting up, I will do it if it will make a difference. As opposed to deciding what energy you want to hold and what actions you want to take, really as that expression of gratitude.
And I think that's one of the things that, you find though too. And even, I mean, I am blessed to have people around me. We may not we don't know how much change we're gonna affect in the world per se, but we definitely affect change, and the biggest changes in our own lives, and then the people around us, and then how big it can get is just kind of like up to how it moves. Deborah?
This is a subject close to my heart about how to communicate without being angry, because I've spent years trying to communicate and nobody's getting the message. So obviously I need to change the way I'm delivering the message. This thing about, I live in a community, an intentional community of a group of irrationals united in the hope of the impossible. For quite a number of years, several decades, this small group of people have managed to continue to live here, about 12 residents in this ranch. And at some point in time, we had to do conflict resolution kind of support, because people were not seeing eye to eye anymore. That coalescence of will had started to crumble. I was desperate. So I talked to my friend who was a member of the Grateful Dead, that commune. And I said, did anybody ever throw things at each other at any stage in your living together? And she says, oh God, yeah, the furniture and everything. And I said, well, what did you do about it? And they said, well, we got a group counselor to come in. And I said, oh, nobody will ever agree to that here. No way. I'll never. She says, well, nobody would agree either. We knew that, but there were two of us that agreed. And so we got the counselor to come, and we just told everybody about it. And they knew that all we were going to do was talk about them. So they all came. So they found a beginning and a way to try to break the chaining that was going on, to save, one of the longer living communities. So that little bit of help did, it's an ongoing, it is a day-to-day process, but where there is a will, there is a way. And if enough people have the will to change their behavior and to try to work against, that knee-jerk reaction, you say stuff that's the opposite of what you really want to have happen in a moment of anger. So we started to, we did this dialectic behavioral therapy. Great stuff.
Okay,
so then I'm back in the environment. And we learned a way to, to recognize those signs. We're chaining now. So I must not have acknowledged what that other person is trying to say. I just acknowledge that, this is what I hear you. I hear you, man. This is what I hear you saying. Is that what you're saying? So we're starting to, living in a community is tough. And then there's the big community. This divide of understanding that I could never understand. Why do people not understand why the earth is hurting because of the things that we're doing? Why don't they understand there's just like this whole sea of people that simply don't see that. And so I would get excited and like I'm getting, my voice is getting strident and tried to communicate something about, you must understand. And they're like, well, finally I said, how is it that you see the world that we're living in now? I finally realized that I was getting nowhere. And these were people that were intelligent and educated and ought to know. And I thought, and so I said, well, if they don't get it, then why? So I simply started to ask these people why, and it was really interesting what I found out. I don't know how much. I'll finish here just in this one observation. They said that they felt that the environmental movement people were all, angry, saying, it's all our fault. We've all done this. We've left this legacy. We've damaged the earth, and woe is us. And now we have to clean up our mess. But these individuals did not feel individual responsibility for the mess that we're in. And so they didn't feel that it was, they didn't feel it was fair that, this kind of rhetoric was going. So it was like the solution-based language is the way, is to come in with this more and to, and ultimately to be able to communicate with somebody that I can't understand, or they don't understand me. I've just, found that you have to build this being to stand in the midst of that confusion. And thank you. I just wanted to share those experiences with this group.
I really appreciate that, because yes, and that can be, they can be challenging to do, because oftentimes we're trying to convince convince other people of how we see it. And so our mindfulness of how we come across or to look at the outcome is to really try to understand rather than be understood, is a massive shift for many, but it opens so much energy in the conversation. Yeah, thank you, Deborah. I love that. Anybody else? Go ahead, Chris.
As an Australian looking at America, I mean, this question's going to come as no surprise, I would imagine. But what people outside of the United States, and this is not, it's just a US issue, but there are a few huge issues in the US that the whole world is paying attention to. And one of them, for example, is Black Lives Matter and that situation and the conversation, and I was struck yesterday by one of the speakers saying, and I think the number was that Philadelphia's population is 40 or 48% African-American, and only 2% of businesses are African-American owned. And at a time where you see in MAGA and you've got one side, you have Black Lives Matter, and the data is pretty clear. And then we see, police killings and etc. So as an outsider, I mean, it's interesting that we're talking outside the United States, but as an outsider looking into the United States, the whole world understands and doesn't understand. So I'd just be interested, your insights as Americans, given this, what's the path through might be.
I think, one of the important things that we really worked on, even when we were in, with this film, as we traveled, was to understand that there aren't sides, and there aren't there's not Israelis are like this, and then Palestinians are like this. Are there some Israelis that want the end of all the Palestinians? Yes, there are some. Are there some Palestinians that want the end of all Israelis? There are some, right? And there are combinations of spectrums of views. And so even if you talk about the Republicans and the Democrats, there isn't a Republican view. There are many different views within that. and the same thing. And as soon as we start categorizing, we lose the complexity. And when we lose the complexity, we lose the ability to see from multiple perspectives, and we just continue narratives from a very limited point of view. And in
Even
that,
the media, even the media's, I was gonna say, Marcy, even the media's, labeling things as blue states and red states. And we agree to that.
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know, for me, for example, I have never registered for a party. And, and I was told when I moved to a different state that I needed to register for a party. And I said, no, I don't. She goes, yes, you do. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Like, I said, actually, I don't. And she goes, well, you do if you're gonna, or if not, you won't be able to vote in the primaries. So even her having the mentality that that's the way it needed to go is a part of it. But how do we create independence within these structures and still be able to have these very important conversations? There are very important conversations about some of the events that have happened in the history and that are currently happening now that have not changed. And how do we open up the conversations and understanding that, and I think, Deborah, what you brought up was incredibly important, because you were talking about how you weren't aware of how you were talking, created perhaps the lack of openness to hearing what you're saying because of your lack of understanding how it was being received. Right? And because at one point, none of us really want to be seen as the bad person or a bad person. And so how do we talk about very important conversations that we bring in a place of wanting to understand solutions so that we can bring out these numbers, are able to have the conversation about it and are able to face some of the more very difficult conversations that we have to have as humanity around humanity, that way of how we treat people in different cultures to how we're treating the environment. But it does start as an individual, and it also starts with the organizations that we're creating. At Reconsider, for example, we are very focused on having a lot of very difficult conversations. We do convenings, and you're bringing up the police. We just had a convening of first responders, police officers, firefighters, and the conversations around the police department right now were profound. And they don't get a chance to actually come together to have those kinds of conversations. And there's not a lot of avenues under which the complexity of what's happening there is able to be understood or shared on a greater stage. And so providing opportunities for these kinds of Zooms or different areas where it's safe enough to have the conversations, because a lot of people don't feel safe enough to have very difficult conversations for the fear of being attacked. And
also, I would say, Marce, that the you often talk about these systems being traumatizing to others, but also those that are in the system are traumatized. And it's very interesting because we did the work with combatants for peace and Palestinians and Israelis. We've done work with veterans and first responders. And one of the things that you hear time and time again is this notion of moral injury. And one of the things that a lot of the police are coming to grips with is their participation in destroying their own communities. And it's very profound. And the ability to hold that space for them to do their own healing and to come to terms with that is very important and very powerful. And it's not just with those that we think about, like veterans and police. It's also true of frontline healthcare workers. We had psychiatrists together, and they were dealing with the same thing. And they talked about the realization that many of them had participated in a system, prescribed different pharmaceuticals, took approaches that they understood were not the most effective for their patients, but they also understood that they were promoted, they had access to academic positions, they were paid well. And so it's not demonizing anybody, but recognizing we can all get caught in these systems. And that, as you know, Marcina likes to talk about, people are traumatized, but there are also systems that are traumatizing.
And I heard a book, the author of a book called, which is controversial, The End of Policing, a couple months ago. And he described how, because, and that on the last, the former session, we were talking about the, you know, the sort of the lack or the defunding of public infrastructure and public good infrastructure across the country. So what was really opening my awareness was, as that has, you know, with just the social safety net has been taken away, police have had to step in and they have to solve so many problems that they are not equipped to solve. And it just opened this connection between how these systems, you know, are just colliding, you know, and then there's just this lack of good public social infrastructure. And again, as privatization of social, what used to be socially funded or government funded. But anyway, but it was a different perspective that really opened my eyes, how these are connecting. That's what.
Absolutely. And they talk a lot about that, you know, the need to be social workers and therapists and nurses and the scope of what they've been asked to do. And I agree also, Chris made a comment about the veterans, but it's true also of the police, that so many of them come in with adverse childhood events in their own history and their own trauma. So, you know, you have traumatized people out there doing this work and not having access to their own healing because it's stigmatized within those communities. So even the way in which we hold mental health in our society and in our communities has a huge impact on the ability for people to seek the care and their own healing.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most important things that we talk about crossing divides, and it brings us back to whether it's environment or what other issues that we're dealing with. Again, it goes back to our ability to first feel inside of ourselves and create an openness and a curiosity, and then to meet this situation, no matter what it is, with this sense of compassion, so that we can begin to learn and act as a helpful bridge for whatever it is to be expressed and transformed. And Caitlin, I don't know if you have a.
Yeah, I had a bit of a reflection. The sort of notion of I think intergenerational inheritance of these constructs is coming up really strongly for me. You know, I think young people learn into these binaries and constructs. They aren't naturally becoming them. If they were allowed to kind of unfold into their own becoming, I think we'd see something radically different. I remember when I was 10 years old, I wrote my first ever persuasive essay for school, and the topic I chose was on why the US bipartisan political system should be abolished. So I've clearly been on a similar tear ever since. But it was because to me as a young person, I just was looking around. I was like, I don't understand what these adults are talking about. Like, obviously it's more complex than this. What are they doing? And I just genuinely didn't understand. And I think that, you know, oftentimes it's easy to fall into some of these labels or binaries because they're simpler, but they're also, you know, this abstraction is also a highly kind of oppressive and colonialist construct. And something that really resonated as well, and something that I think in what Steve and also part of what Chris shared was around how these systemic oppressions do harm everyone, right? It's the construct of war that's harming everyone. Gerrymandering of communities harms everyone. Disproportionate hoarding of wealth, I speak a lot to how that harms those who inherit wealth too. It doesn't just harm those who lack access to it. And then it came up earlier in this discussion how kind of someone might be burning trash over there and it's harming kind of the air that we're all breathing. But I think we've lost maybe some of the vocabulary to start to kind of make visible or quantify some of that complexity. And I think that's a similar pattern to the patterning that causes a lot of the abstraction or simplification that causes us to look at other things in ways that are maybe not whole systems lenses, which is how we end up causing a lot of the other, environmental and other crises that we've been speaking to this week. So I don't have an answer, but I do have a suspicion that if we can find a way to maintain some of that complexity and that nuance I think we're dealing with a bit of a scale issue because things like social media or broadcast media by necessity to kind of communicate at that scale lose so much fidelity and detail compared to what you would find in a one-on-one conversation. And so I've long been very curious what the ways are to kind of manifest some of that quality of being sort of one-to-one at scale.
I also think, and Chris brought it up before too. I mean, I think we have to not give up on hope that we make a difference with what we're saying, so that we can feel inspired to use our voice and to learn how to use it in a way that is impactful and positive. And then when we model it for young people and we give the voice to young people, we give a platform for it in different ways too, and not even give it, it's almost more like don't take it away from them. It's a very important part of their learning, that what they say and what they're doing also makes a big difference. So, yeah. Elizabeth, did you have? Nope. You're mute.
Yeah, sorry. In my own work, there's so many alignments that I'm hearing in this conversation. And for me, like Katie, I was very confused as a young person and got very radical in middle school because I didn't understand. So it set me off on a journey to, I realized that this is like, I'm feeling into this space of all the sessions that I've sat through in the last 2 days. This one really gets to this nexus of what I feel is really our, I call it the evolutionary imperative, because our world has gotten so complex that if we're not able to reestablish our common ground, because we're so complex, because we're so now interconnected, we have to keep coming back to our common ground. And what I've identified, and Katie will know this, is water. Like that, like if we can really come down to the core basics and realize that all of our blood runs red, that at our very heart of hearts, we have this commonality of being part of life. And so I'm really interested in exploring the language of how to communicate this. Like one thing, the climate crisis, if we're living and breathing, we're contributing to it. Just the simple fact of being alive, we're contributing to it. So how do we speak to it in such a way that we're really allowing us to find that commonality?
Do you know the book Journey of the Universe?
No.
I would highly suggest that. I think one of the most powerful things that we have is to remember and be brought back into the mystery of life itself. And Journey of the Universe is a really good book. And Mary Evelyn Tucker, is just brilliant in the work that she does that way. So, and I love that, Elizabeth, what you were saying.
Who's the author?
Mary Evelyn Tucker and Brian Swim.
Okay.
And because there is a place that I think one of the things that we often use with what we're doing is bring people back into curiosity. And it actually is shown on the brain that when you use curiosity, it's funny because it's actually, they say it's similar to psychedelics. What it does is shut down the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and allows new connections to be made. And that's why I'm saying, if you use curiosity with people and just go, that's interesting, tell me more. It's like literally, it can change the conversation because they can feel seen, heard, and then at that point, they're open also to be able to hear. But it's also an energetic, we communicate more with energy than we do words. And so it's how we say it's can be so powerful. Chris?
I wanted to I find even the language I'm about to use interesting, because it's language that's used in other sessions, and that is a provocation. So it's interesting in this session to talk about when we say, I want to put a provocation in, and the provocation I want to put it in without knowing where it goes is that we've talked about, and this has been playing on my mind, we've talked about the other and hostile groups. And in the past, we talked about money, and I want to channel, imagine that I'm a Goldman Sachs investment banker and I'm in this room right now. And how would that style of thinking function here? And I've been surrounded by these sorts of people for many parts of my life. And it is interesting to me. So I'm just thinking it through. I just thought, and that's why I was wanted to be a bit playful in a sense, just thinking, all right, why don't I pretend I'm the Goldman Sachs investment banker right now in the room? And how do I respond to hearing this? And, even this conversation, as somebody who has a functional worldview, which is very much organized around just the functioning of power, I think it's really, and that's how it works. And so a sort of slightly Darwinian power function rationale. How do I hear this, and what do I say to you? And it's a thought experiment in my own mind here. And that's why I just wanted to throw it in as a thought experiment to people who don't want to be self-aware, because they think that that's kind of implicit to that. I think it's not self-awareness, but a kind of evolutionary functional behavior. I think my response to it is to demonstrate the better outcomes or the happiness, that there's a win by adopting this, that they're I'm just trying to think through. So I just wanted to pause it there as a provocation, given the fact that we've talked a bit about wanting the money people to get involved in this conversation.
It's interesting, and Mars, I'd be interested in your take as well, but it seems like, having the conversation around the outcomes and the analysis is being stuck in the mind. And we talk a lot about, if you think about a wheel of the heart in the south, spirit in the east, the mind in the north, and the body in the west. And, if the one thing that we've seen time and time again is that when you create a space for the authentic conversation that is not adversarial and trying to win a point or to convince somebody of something, but you invite them into more of a heart space, that the suffering, even of the Goldman Sachs executives, is just below the surface. And allowing for that space to exist and inviting them into that can be very powerful.
I've worked with a few Goldman partners, and so I say this firsthand. It is what you're saying is true. The challenge is, and I've seen this, and I think they acknowledge, is that when they're stressed, they revert. So when you're in the hope space, you grab this willingly. Yes. When the stress arises, you revert to something else. And that's kind of really the interesting edge to be explored.
I have a suspicion that Sushant might have something very juicy to add here, but no, don't need to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Can you hear me, by the way? I just realized my
A little
mic is-
muffled.
Yeah. I think I might have lost my mic here. There it is. Yeah, so one of the things that I think often gets missed out is sort of the way we learn about nature and each other in different contexts. So for example, we talk about theory of change a lot. There are all kinds of meta models and different ways of making change. How do we impact, different measurements of impact and all that. And that's really great. And I think there's an evolution of sort of, empiricism and modernism that has come through postmodernism and has brought in a certain way of looking at the world. But one of the challenges that I see as somebody who grew up in a completely different culture, different language, different context, and also lived in America half my life, is that oftentimes, the way we learn about different cultures gets lost. And it was really in sort of the Western Enlightenment era that it sort of consolidated the way to look at the world in one way, which we now know as sort of the Western framework, right? And it has tremendous value. I mean, the technology we are using right now is sort of a derivative of that. But what happens is that I think the theory of change and social innovations were always embedded in traditional cultures and in indigenous cultures around the world. So one example of that would be, every culture, if you look at it, they have very special relationship with the sun. I come from Asian cultures. Asians love to worship the sun. There's rituals around it. There's dance around it. There's all kinds of mantras around it. In the yoga, sun salutations around it, all kinds of stuff around it. And every indigenous culture has some form of that or the other. And what sun really represents is actually the culture. What that means is the relationship that indigenous people have with their culture is the same as the relationship with the sun, which is it's ancient, but new with every sunrise. What that means is that, the social innovation piece is actually embedded in those cultures already. And a lot of the rituals, a lot of the ways that a culture renews itself is already embedded in it. And so oftentimes I think, we tend to miss that part. Cultures innovate and re-innovate themselves through their own paradigms and, through their languages, the evolution of languages and all that. And I think it's not factual in my experience that traditions and indigenous cultures are directly in conflict with modernism. In fact, there can be an indigenous modernism, there can be traditional modernism, and there's been enough sort of talk around it right now. So I think it is also about stepping back and looking at, what are some of the ways that we are actually learning and talking about this innovative framework and impact. And I think that's really matters. And there's a lot to be said about that. And I think I was really hoping to bring somebody here who's written a book called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Worldview Can Save the World, which really talked about how indigenous people mind are different, and there are different types of mind, just like, sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, we just got back from Brazil, where there was a gathering of 31 indigenous tribes there. And, I think what's interesting when one of the things that we have noticed and talking about is that in one way, the indigenous knowledge is in each of us. It's almost like, because we at one point were all connected. We still are, but I mean, we were aware of the connection and our need to honor the land and what was around us for our own survival. And I think there was a period of time that there was a disconnect that started to happen. And even in the tribes right now, they were talking about one of their biggest concerns is this technology is creating this disconnect, and they're losing their young people to the city, but also to this way of thinking. And so it's interesting to feel like what you're talking about, their ability to bridge what we're calling modernism, whatever that means, because that may mean something different to different people. and still carrying the essence of what we're calling indigenous, which I think you're meaning by it again, it's kind of is that connection to the land, but also to life itself as a oneness in humanity. Is that what you're kind of referring to?
Yeah.
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 And if it's possible to imbue that intelligence of the indigenous connection into a more like AI kind of perhaps way of functioning in this on the planet. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the divide of many of you already spoke to this is, white people versus other people is quite destructive, because I think somebody wrote on chat, right? I mean, we have indigenous roots. And I think, oftentimes the kind of the battles that we find around is, making sure that those kind of voices are heard. But I'm of the mind that this sort of white sort of the battle against the white fragility and sort of the white, and there's whiteness there, but I think it's a lot deeper, and I think it's not been very productive. I have many friends, including my partner who runs a nonprofit organization, who's been sort of really attacked for being white in the position of leadership, and I think that's not really helpful.
I guess Siko, is it Siko? Would you like to say something or?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I mean, it's been wonderful just listening in. Yeah, and I think from just going back from when you started, Masina, when you mentioned about the project being about bridge building or building bridges, around the film itself, and how, of course, now that thread has now actually gone through every single viewpoint or perspective, or even the different points that we've touched on during this. I think, how long have we been actually in this room? But I think that building bridges aspect has really, I would say, is the radical center really around this discussion, because really it is about building bridges. It is about crossing over. It is about allowing others into your space, and I guess maybe just finding comfort as well in discomfort, because through the discomfort, I think there's growth, there is revelation, and there's new perspective that one gains, and this is where wisdom comes from. I think if you allow yourself to be open to receive, unlearning and learning, I think that's where the wisdom then comes from. So really the conversations that we're having here, I think there's greater wisdom here in that is actually now growing in every individual here. But I think the personal experiences that we have as individuals, from my perspective, I to be honest, I live the division on a daily basis. In my country, really, it's the history is relived every day. So we're still on a path of forgiveness. I think someone spoke about forgiveness, but also the accountability part of saying who owns or who's willing or who is taking responsibility or ownership for what is happening now, and who is actually saying that I want to be responsible for the future that we are creating. So I think the lesson here is to say, how do we continue building bridges? but also being aware of the challenges that building bridges actually brings with itself. I mean, it's a laborious activity. I think it's quite an intentional activity, but I think the rewards of bridge building, for the best part, I would like to think that can only be experienced in the next generations to come. So the work that we are doing now, I think, is really plowing in, is really about claiming and reclaiming and basically putting a stake and saying that this is the path that we are taking, but the rewards of the actions or the work that we are doing now will only manifest, I would say, or really be enjoyed by those generations to come. Yeah, so thank you for really creating the space, Caitlin, and even deciding on having this as a discussion point, because I mean, we could speak for another, I think, for another day around this. Because I think at different levels, we've all experienced some sort of trauma that comes out of separation or division. And so that's what really connects us, because again, we are all one humanity, right? We all belong to one place, one source. How we then see that, or how we express that, really, as Sushant was saying, about the sun, is really how we then, I mean, that decision really lies in the experiences and the influences that we have from day to day. But thank you once again. Really engaging and really marvelous to actually listen. Just listening. I think for the best part from my side, really what I've taken away is always being open to learn new things and new ways and new perspectives, and connecting with everyone here. Thank you.
There's something that you said, though, I think that's incredibly important, that I wanted to touch on. You know, when we were down in the Brazil, we were down there filming, and we were one of very few white people down there, and I could feel the mistrust, and I owned the reason. I mean, I don't have any problem with saying I can understand why you can't trust me, and it doesn't mean that I'm the one that did anything, but that there's a place that I can take responsibility, and it's okay for you to not feel comfortable with me, and to be able to have the conversations in front of me about what the white men have done down there in the Amazon and the extraction that's happened, and for me to be able to hear that and not have to feel defensive myself, but say, yes, there has been this kind of stuff that's gone on, and I can understand why there's a mistrust there. I think it's a part of healing when we can acknowledge things that have happened that maybe we ourselves haven't done. And there, it can be a way of, I think, meeting some of this real harm that has been done. One of the people, and I'll just say really quickly, one of the people on our board is a Lakota leader, and his mom, when he, just to give birth, had to because it was illegal to have him at home, had to get to a place where she could deliver, and no one was around, so she had it. And in telling the story, there is a place where I can own that the way that we've created things have made it a burden to to cultures, to people, including many white people. Okay, it's not exclusive of it, but how do we begin to have those conversations so that we can and maybe own some of it in different ways and allow it to move. So thanks you everybody for this amazing conversation, and thank you, Caitlin, and everything that you're doing here.
Thank
Really
you.
wonderful to be here with everyone.
Thank you so much for holding this space. John?
Really glad I could join this afternoon. Here's John Allen. He's my partner, visionary biospheric pioneer.
Hey, John.
Hi, John.
Sina,
Thanks for all you guys are still doing.
from Reconsider. They're from the Reconsider group in New York. We'll see you in the next room.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
So,
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Close this one out. I put the link for the next chat or the next session in the chat because we did go a little bit over here, but we're having another session for the next 80 minutes still. And one of the speakers in that one, which is on kind of the intersections between soil health and nutrition, is Adam Fishman from Enora, who has this really interesting story in that he started with, measuring carbon offsets and somehow found his way to instead curating curiosity conversations with high school students. And so we'll be learning about that over in the other Zoom. And I linked to that in the chat, and I'm just going to paste it one more time right here. And I'll see you.
Appreciate everyone being here. Thanks so much.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Beautiful.